On May 26, 946, in the hall of Pucklechurch, music and laughter turned into screams. Edmund I, the Anglo-Saxon king only 25 years old, was stabbed to death in the middle of a sacred feast by a man he had once exiled. In an instant, the young ruler's blood mixed with wine, and the glow of celebration collapsed into silence. His sudden death became a haunting reminder of how fragile the medieval crown truly was, where glory and violence lived side by side. The story of Edmund the Magnificent begins not with his own crown, but with the shadow of a dynasty that had already reshaped England. He was born in 921, the son of Edward the Elder, grandson of Alfred the Great, and heir to the Wessex bloodline that had carved order out of chaos. His very existence was a continuation of that fragile dream. The unification of a land scarred by war, torn between kingdoms, and stalked by Viking sails on every horizon. Edmund entered the world in a time of both triumph and tension. His grandfather, Alfred the Great, had turned the tide against Viking invaders, defending Wessex when all seemed lost. His father, Edward, carried that torch further, consolidating control over much of England. The boy Edmund was not just another royal child. He was a living promise, a vessel into which the hopes of a dynasty were poured. His birth meant continuity. It meant that the crown of Wessex would not die with Edward, but flow into another generation. But childhood in the 10th century was never innocent, not even for princes. Mortality stalked every cradle. Illness, famine, and violence claimed lives without warning. To be born into royalty was not a shield against fragility. It was a weight. From his earliest years, Edmund was raised with the knowledge that he was more than a child. He was England's insurance policy. His every step, his every lesson, was preparation for a role that could not be refused. He grew up in the company of siblings who would all feel the press of history, most notably his elder brother Athelstan, a figure who would become one of England's first true kings in name as well as power. Athelstan was older, seasoned, and already destined to wear the crown after Edward's death. Yet Edmund, watching from the shadows of childhood, absorbed the lessons of court life and war. He learned to hold a sword, to read the signs of loyalty and betrayal, to understand that every noble's smile could hide a dagger. The court of Wessex was a place of ceremony, yes, but also of ceaseless calculation. Allies were never permanent. Enemies could suddenly become kin by marriage. Behind the tapestries and beneath the feasts, politics seethed. Young Edmund witnessed this turbulence. His tutors taught him the chronicles of past kings, but his truest education came from the whispers that filled the halls at night. He was learning not just how to rule, but how to survive. The land itself was restless. Though his father had claimed dominion over large swaths of England, unity was a fragile illusion. In the north, the kingdom of Northumbria remained a hotbed of Norse power, its allegiance shifting like the tides. In the east, Danish settlers had left permanent marks on the culture and politics. The kingdom Edmund was born into was less a single nation than a patchwork quilt held together by ambition and blood. At any moment, one thread could unravel the whole. In this storm of uncertainty, the boy's lineage was his destiny. He was marked as the continuation of Alfred's vision, a king who would hold together what had been won. Yet destiny is a double-edged sword. It gives a man purpose, but it also chains him. From his earliest breath, Edmund's life was not his own. The chroniclers who later remembered him often dwelt on his courage, his decisiveness, his nobility. But those traits did not spring from nowhere. They were forged in the crucible of expectation. Imagine being a boy of 10, already aware that you may one day rule, already knowing that failure would mean not just your own ruin, but the unraveling of a dynasty. Childhood games for Edmund were not about play, but rehearsal. Every mock sword fight was a lesson in command. Every journey with his father's retinue was a glimpse of the machinery of kingship. He was being sculpted into an heir long before the crown was even visible on the horizon. The presence of Alfred's legacy loomed large. Alfred was not just remembered as a king, but almost as a saint, a figure of near mythic stature. To be his grandson was to live under an unbearable comparison. How could any child, no matter how gifted, stand equal to a man who had been called the Great? For Edmund, the inheritance was both gift and curse. It gave him legitimacy, but it also set a standard no mortal could easily meet. The land of his youth was not peaceful. Raids still scarred the coastlines. Border disputes flared like brush fires. The people of England lived with constant reminders that security was temporary, that invaders and rebels could strike at will. For the young prince, these were not distant rumors, but formative truths. He was growing up in a land that demanded strength, vigilance, and sacrifice. And within him, there was a spark. Chroniclers suggest that, even as a youth, Edmund displayed qualities that marked him as more than a second son. He was observant, courageous, perhaps more willing than others to take risks. He was not content to simply exist in Athelstan's shadow. History would soon call him forward, sooner than anyone expected. The story of Edmund the Magnificent is thus not the tale of a king who rose from obscurity, but of a boy born into inevitability. His legacy was carved into him before he could walk. His bloodline dictated his path. His childhood was less a beginning and more a prelude to the heavy crown that would rest upon his head. He was a child of legacy, and that legacy, both glorious and fatal, would shape every step of his brief, tragic reign. In the autumn of 939, the bells of England tolled for Athelstan, the first king who had managed, however briefly, to bind the English realm into a single crown. His death left behind not only a kingdom trembling at its edges, but also a young brother barely 18 years old. That brother was Edmund, suddenly thrust from the shadows of youth into the blinding light of monarchy. It is hard to imagine what it meant to be 18 in the 10th century. Today, 18 is still a beginning, a threshold into adulthood. But in Edmund's time, it was already an age of command. He was no longer merely a prince of Wessex. He was now king of the English, carrying on his shoulders the fragile unity that Athelstan had forged. The crown did not wait for maturity. It demanded loyalty, decisiveness, and the ability to act as though wisdom had already settled in his bones. The coronation itself was both a moment of triumph and a silent test. In the abbey, where incense hung thick in the air and monks chanted solemn prayers, Edmund was anointed with holy oil, the ritual binding him not only to his people, but to God himself. The weight of the crown was heavier than any gold or silver. It was the embodiment of a promise that he would defend the church, uphold justice, and protect the realm from its enemies. Yet behind the solemnity, everyone in attendance knew the truth. This was a boy standing where seasoned kings had fallen. His first challenge came almost immediately, and it was brutal. In Northumbria, the Norse settlers sensed weakness in the transition. Athelstan's firm grip had held them in check. But with his death, rebellion festered like fire in dry timber. Edmund, barely crowned, found himself facing the harsh reality that kingship was not ceremony, but war. The chronicles tell us that Olaf Guthfrithson, a Viking ruler from Dublin, seized the moment and reclaimed York. For the young king, this was a direct affront. Northumbria was not simply a distant province. It was the northern key to the kingdom, the border that either secured or shattered England. To lose it meant that Athelstan's dream of unity was already unraveling. Edmund's court was divided. Some urged caution. Let the north go, they whispered, and consolidate the south. Others pressed him to act, to ride immediately and prove that the new king was no child but a warrior. The choice was his, and it was a choice that would define him. Edmund chose war. Imagine him then, 18 years old, armor glinting in the uncertain English sun, leading men twice his age into the field. His youth, which in other times might have been a weakness, became in that moment a weapon. The men of Wessex, Mercia, and beyond looked upon their king and saw not hesitation, but boldness. Courage, after all, is often mistaken for recklessness, and in youth, the line between the two is razor thin. The campaigns were bloody and uncertain. Raids cut deep into the countryside, battles raged across the borderlands, and the new king had to learn quickly how to command, how to inspire, how to fear and yet not falter. Chroniclers later praised his resolve, but we should not romanticize what it meant. Each campaign meant villages burned, harvests ruined, and men buried beneath soil that had barely cooled from earlier wars. The price of kingship was not only borne by the king, it was borne by every peasant who tilled the land, every family who watched their sons march away. Yet Edmund endured. He negotiated, he fought, and little by little, he clawed back what had been lost. By 944, just 5 years into his reign, he managed to retake Northumbria. His persistence was rewarded. The boy who had been crowned in the shadow of his brother was now proving himself in the fire of war. But victory did not come without scars. For a youth who should have been enjoying the blossoming of life, Edmund's years were carved into campaigns, diplomacy, and endless vigilance. Every feast day was shadowed by the possibility of revolt. Every trusted noble might also be a conspirator. Every celebration of victory carried the whisper of the next uprising. He was learning faster than any young man should, that the crown was not a symbol of security, but of permanent danger. The image of Edmund as a teenage heir is therefore complex. On the one hand, he embodied the hopes of continuity, the bloodline of Alfred the Great, the courage of youth willing to stake all on the battlefield. On the other, he was still a boy forced to navigate the labyrinth of medieval politics, where betrayal could be dressed in silk and friendship could end in a blade. And in that crucible, his character began to form. He was no philosopher king, no cloistered monarch removed from the hardships of rule. He was, from the very beginning, a warrior and a risk-taker, one who believed that a king must meet threats head-on. That courage would win him battles. But as fate would soon prove, it would also blind him to dangers that lurked closer than any Viking army. Edmund at 18 was not simply a king inheriting a throne. He was a young man walking a tightrope stretched between glory and ruin. Each step he took secured the fragile dream of England. But each step also brought him closer to the tragic destiny that would claim him before his 26th year. The ink of Edmund's coronation oath was barely dry when he faced the greatest test of his young reign: the fate of Northumbria. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a remote frontier, but to the Anglo-Saxon world, it was the hinge of England's destiny. Whoever held York controlled not only a city, but the doorway to the North Sea, the heart of trade, and the gate through which Viking power flowed like a tide. Athelstan had subdued it. For a moment, under his iron hand, Northumbria bent to the authority of Wessex. But with his death, the grip loosened. Olaf Guthfrithson, the Viking king from Dublin, sensed the opening. He sailed across the Irish Sea, rallied the Norse settlers, and seized York. The dream of a united England cracked like fragile glass, and all eyes turned to Edmund. He was barely 18, untested, and already the kingdom's survival rested on his shoulders. For Edmund, the question was not theoretical. Northumbria was more than lines on a map. It was a living wound. If it remained in Norse hands, the North would once again become a launching ground for raids and rebellions. Worse, it would signal to every rival that the crown of England was a prize ripe for challenge. The throne he had inherited could vanish before it was truly his. The young king's council urged caution. Some suggested compromise, others urged tribute. But Edmund was cut from different cloth. The blood of Alfred the Great ran in his veins, and he believed a king who yielded once would be forced to yield forever. War, though dangerous, was the only answer. So he gathered his levies. From Wessex and Mercia, men were summoned. Farmers left their fields, smiths their forges, monks their cloisters, all to bear shield and spear under the dragon banner. The army that formed was not the disciplined legions of Rome, nor the mercenary bands of the continent. It was a patchwork host of free men and nobles, bound not by contract, but by loyalty to their king and fear of losing the land beneath their feet. Imagine the march north, long columns of weary men, trudging through rain and mud, their armor clanking with each step. Behind them trailed supply wagons laden with salted meat, grain, and mead. Ahead of them lay not only the Vikings, but the unforgiving landscape of Northumbria itself. Windswept moors, bitter cold, and rivers swollen with autumn rains. This was not merely a campaign of swords, but of endurance. The clash came swiftly. Olaf's Norsemen were hardened raiders, skilled in ambush and sudden violence. Edmund's forces met them in brutal field battles, where the shield walls slammed together like colliding storms. Chroniclers speak of the chaos, the splintering of spears, the roar of men locked in combat, the ground turned slick with blood. For Edmund, these were no longer lessons whispered by tutors or imagined glories sung in sagas. This was kingship, naked, merciless, and written in flesh. In the early years, the war was uncertain. Victories were costly, defeats humbling. Yet Edmund refused to relent. Each setback only sharpened his determination. By 941, Olaf was dead, struck down by fate, and a new rival, Olaf Quarren, rose to claim York. The Norse grip endured, but Edmund pressed harder, forging alliances with Scottish rulers and Welsh princes, weaving a fragile web of support. He was learning that war was not only fought with swords, but with promises, hostages, and oaths. By 944, the tide had turned. Edmund launched a decisive campaign, pressing northward with relentless force. One by one, Norse strongholds fell. York itself, that jewel of the north, returned to English hands. Chroniclers record it as a triumph, a moment when the dream of unity was restored. For a brief, shining instant, the boy king had proven himself worthy of the crown he bore. And yet, the fires of war left scars deeper than victory could heal. Entire villages were left in ashes. Families were broken. Men who marched with Edmund never returned, their bodies buried in unmarked graves beneath the cold soil. To win back Northumbria, Edmund had to spend the lives of his people like coin. And though he secured the realm, the price was steep. Still, in the eyes of his subjects, Edmund emerged as a king transformed. He was no longer the teenage heir of uncertain promise. He was a warrior who had faced the storm and endured. His name carried weight, his authority firm, Songs began to call him the Magnificent, not for a reign of peace, but for victories seized in the teeth of war. But beneath the triumph lay a hidden danger. War had taught him to confront threats head-on, to seize his enemies with his own hands rather than delegate to others. It made him bold, perhaps too bold. The courage that had won him Northumbria would one day drive him to a reckless act at a feast in Pucklechurch, where his own strength would lead him straight into the blade of an enemy. For now, though, the fires of war had baptized him. The young king, once doubted, now stood as the defender of Alfred's legacy. The realm was united, the Vikings pushed back, the crown secure. Yet history has a cruel way of turning triumph into tragedy. And for Edmund, the victories in Northumbria were not the end of struggle, but the beginning of the fate that would claim him long before his time. Victory in Northumbria had crowned Edmund with glory, but it also revealed the paradox of medieval kingship. The more a ruler triumphed, the more he became a target. By his early 20s, Edmund was hailed as the savior of England's unity, the heir who had defended Alfred's dream against the Norse. Chroniclers called him the Magnificent, yet behind the praise lurked whispers, and behind the loyalty of his warriors lingered the shadows of ambition and envy. He was still young, 20, 21, 22. These were ages at which men today begin careers or families. For Edmund, they were years of steel and blood. His court was a hall of blades, each smile hiding calculation. Nobles bent the knee, but each had their own desires. To hold a crown was to live in suspicion, to watch every hand at the feast, to listen for betrayal in every word of praise. The campaigns in the north had left him hardened. No longer the untested teenager, Edmund carried himself with the confidence of a man who had faced death and won. He spoke less than before, his words clipped, deliberate. When he walked into a hall, men rose not only out of duty, but out of a quiet fear. He was their king, yes, but he was also the embodiment of war. A reminder that the crown was forged in violence and could be defended only in the same. England, for a moment, basked in relative calm. The Viking threat had been pushed back, and alliances with Scotland and Wales had been sealed with oaths and hostages. The realm stretched from the northern rivers to the southern coast, and Edmund's banners flew proudly across it. To many, it seemed that the kingdom had entered a golden dawn. But to those who looked closer, the cracks remained. The peace was not peace in the modern sense. It was a fragile balance of fear, tribute, and exhaustion. Raids could flare up without warning. Rival claimants, distant kin of royal blood, still dreamed of seizing the throne. In the monasteries, monks prayed for stability, yet even their illuminated manuscripts recorded an undertone of anxiety. Everyone knew that the realm, though larger than ever, was also brittle. A single fracture could shatter it. For Edmund himself, the challenge shifted. Having proven himself in war, he now had to prove himself in rule. This was often the harder task. Victory on the battlefield was swift and decisive. Governance, by contrast, was slow and uncertain. He faced disputes over land, feuds between noble families, and the endless question of justice. Every judgment he rendered made him friends and enemies alike. A king could win battles and still lose his crown to discontent. Yet Edmund showed a surprising gift for decisiveness. He issued charters that strengthened the church, binding the clergy to his cause. He confirmed lands for loyal nobles, ensuring their allegiance. And though the law was harsh, he upheld it firmly. In an age where kings were often accused of weakness or cruelty, Edmund walked a narrow path of stern authority. It earned him respect, but it also deepened resentment among those who felt slighted. The young king's image in these years was carefully cultivated. He was seen not only as a warrior, but as a guardian of tradition. He upheld the legacy of his father and grandfather, invoking the memory of Alfred in his charters. His reign was presented as continuity, as if the hand of God itself had guided him from heir to ruler. Yet beneath this crafted image, Edmund himself was still a man, young, ambitious, prone to flashes of temper. Those closest to him noted his impulsiveness, the way he sometimes acted before thinking, as if courage alone could conquer all obstacles. That courage had carried him through war, but in peace, it could become recklessness. He was not one to delegate dangers to others. If a threat appeared, he often confronted it himself. This trait endeared him to his warriors, who admired a king unafraid to act. But it also exposed him, leaving him vulnerable to enemies who preferred daggers to armies. At feasts, he was the center of attention, drinking with his men, speaking boldly, and showing the energy of youth. His laughter carried across the hall, his confidence unmistakable. And yet, in the candlelit corners, his enemies studied him. They saw not only a king in his prime, but also a man who could be provoked, who might rise too quickly to anger, who might confront danger head-on rather than let guards intervene. It was in these very traits that his doom began to take shape. The shadow of swords hung over his reign. Though he had won Northumbria, he could not erase the memory of exile and punishment for those who had opposed him. Among them were men like Leofa, a figure whispered about in dark corners, a man who nursed hatred for the king who had cast him out. Such enemies did not challenge openly. They waited, biding their time, blending into the life of the realm like embers smoldering beneath ash. Edmund, perhaps too confident in his youth, did not fear them as he should have. To him, kingship was a role of courage. If danger came, he would meet it directly, just as he had on the battlefield. That mindset, noble though it seemed, was the crack in his armor. In the brutal world of the 10th century, kings were not felled only by armies. They were felled by knives at feasts, poison in cups, betrayals whispered in shadows. By the mid-940s, Edmund's reign seemed secure, yet destiny was already circling. His victories had made him magnificent. But magnificence is often a fragile flame, burning brightest just before it is extinguished. In his halls, surrounded by songs of triumph, he could not know that his greatest danger would not come from foreign armies or rebellious lords, but from a single man, once disgraced, who still carried a knife and a memory of humiliation. Every kingdom has its ghosts, men banished, dishonored, and left to wander beyond the safety of walls. Most fade into obscurity, but some, nursing wounds of pride and rage, return with vengeance burning in their hearts. For Edmund the Magnificent, that ghost bore a name: Leofa. The records that survive tell us little about him. He was not a great noble, not a mighty earl with armies at his back. He was rather a man of lower standing, perhaps a thane or a retainer, someone who once enjoyed a measure of honor within Edmund's realm. But whatever station he held, it ended in disgrace. Leofa was sentenced, condemned for crimes we cannot fully know, and exiled from the kingdom. In the brutal world of the 10th century, exile was worse than death. To be exiled meant more than losing land or title. It meant losing identity itself. A man stripped of lord and kin became rootless, unmoored in a society where loyalty and belonging were the lifeblood of survival. The forests, the moors, the borderlands, These became his prison. Without the protection of law, he was a wolf among men, a fugitive who lived at the mercy of strangers. Each passing day, hunger gnawed at him, and each night the cold reminded him of the hall he had lost. But for Leofa, the true torment was not physical. It was pride. To be cast out by his king, by a young ruler barely older than himself, was a humiliation that seared his soul. Each step he took beyond England's borders deepened the scar. While others might have resigned themselves to obscurity, Leofa let hatred take root. It grew quietly, like a poisoned seed, fed by every memory of insult and every image of Edmund's growing glory. He must have heard the news from afar. Reports of Edmund's victories, of Northumbria reclaimed, of the people hailing him as the Magnificent. Each story would have been like salt poured into an open wound. For Edmund, war had forged greatness. For Leofa, exile had forged vengeance. The Anglo-Saxon world was never one of secure borders. Men crossed rivers and forests with ease, messengers spread tales, and exiles like Leofa slipped between lands unseen. He wandered, he waited, and as the years passed, his hatred matured into a single purpose. He would not simply kill a man, he would kill a king. He would turn Edmund's magnificence into a memory soaked in blood. Meanwhile, at court, the king likely gave him no thought. Leofa was gone, another criminal lost to the wilderness. Edmund, surrounded by advisors and warriors, did not imagine that such a man could breach the sanctity of his feasts. And yet, it is often the forgotten enemy who strikes hardest. The chronicles that recall Leofa's act speak of his sudden reappearance at Pucklechurch in 946. How he arrived there remains a mystery. Did he sneak into the hall disguised as a guest? Did he linger at the edges of the crowd, waiting for the right moment? Or did he simply stride in boldly, fueled by the madness of vengeance? History is silent. What it does tell us is that when the king recognized him, the fuse of tragedy was lit. But to understand that moment, we must imagine Leofa's state of mind. Years of exile had stripped him of fear. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous of all. His hand, clutching a concealed blade, must have trembled not with hesitation, but with anticipation. He had lived for this instant, endured misery for this singular act. For him, the hall of Pucklechurch was not a place of worship or celebration. It was the stage upon which he would etch his revenge into history. And Edmund, young and impulsive, played his part unknowingly. When he saw Leofa, his instinct was not to signal his guards, not to let others handle the danger. True to the nature forged in war, he confronted the threat himself. The very courage that had won him battles now drove him headlong into peril. He approached, intending to seize or subdue the exile with his own hands. This was the fatal symmetry of their lives. Edmund, crowned and magnificent, believed that bravery could overcome all. Leofa, disgraced and forgotten, believed that vengeance was worth more than life itself. When these two convictions collided in the hall, no one, not noble, not priest, not servant, could stop the blade that followed. Exile had not broken Leofa. It had refined him into an instrument of hate. In the end, his name would be remembered only for one deed, the assassination of a king. But in that deed lies the haunting reminder of medieval rule, that power does not always fall to rival armies or foreign invaders. Sometimes it falls to a single man, banished and bitter, who slips into a feast with murder in his heart. Thus, in the story of Edmund the Magnificent, Leofa becomes not just an assassin, but a symbol. He embodies the truth that the dangers of kingship were not confined to distant battlefields. They lurked in the very heart of celebration, in the faces of the forgotten, in the hands of men who had once been loyal. And it was this shadow, carried by Leofa, that would soon extinguish the bright flame of a 25-year-old king. On May 26, 946, the people of England gathered not for battle, but for celebration. It was the feast of St. Augustine, a holy day marked by prayer, music, and communal joy. At Pucklechurch, a royal estate nestled in Gloucestershire, King Edmund presided over a banquet. The hall was alive with sound, the rhythmic chant of monks giving blessings, the crackling of torches against wooden beams, the clatter of goblets filled with wine. For once, after years of war, the air carried not the scent of blood, but the sweetness of roast meat and mead. Here was a king in his prime, only 25. Edmund had already fought wars, reclaimed kingdoms, and earned the name, the Magnificent. At the banquet table, he embodied both strength and youth. Surrounded by nobles, retainers, and clergy, he laughed, he toasted, he appeared as invincible as any ruler of the age could hope to be. The court sang his praises, and the people of the hall looked upon him with admiration. For a brief moment, England seemed secure, its king untouchable. But feasts in the Middle Ages were never only about joy. They were stages of politics, where alliances were tested over goblets of wine, and rivalries simmered just beneath the surface. Every seat carried weight, every gesture was observed. And in the shadows of this particular feast lurked a figure no one expected to see. Leofa, the exile. No chronicle tells us exactly how he entered. Perhaps he slipped in with the throng of servants. Perhaps he found his way among the lesser guests, blending into the crowd. What is certain is that he stood within the same hall as the king, his heart hardened, his hand near the dagger that had traveled with him through years of exile. To the revelers, he was just another face. To Edmund, once his eyes caught him, he was the embodiment of past judgment, returned like a ghost to demand reckoning. The moment of recognition must have cut through the noise of the feast like a cold wind. Imagine the king's gaze sharpening, his laughter fading, his youthful energy shifting into sudden alertness. Here was a man he had once cast out, a man who by rights should not have been within 100 miles of Pucklechurch, standing in the very hall of celebration. Edmund's nature, shaped in battle, was not to hesitate. He could have signaled his guards. He could have let others seize the exile. But this was not his way. Courage, or perhaps pride, drove him to rise from his seat and stride toward Leofa himself. To confront the danger directly was his instinct, the very instinct that had won him victories in the field. Yet within the walls of a feast, that courage would prove fatal. Those nearby must have sensed the tension instantly. Nobles exchanged nervous glances, servants froze in their duties. The music faltered as the king advanced. The hall, moments before filled with joy, now tightened with silence. The torches flickered, and all eyes turned to the confrontation unfolding in the center of the room. Edmund reached for Leofa, intending to drag him out or subdue him by force. And it was then that Leofa acted. With the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, he drew his blade. In an instant, steel flashed in the torchlight, cutting through the air before the guards could intervene. The dagger struck the king. Accounts vary. Some say it pierced his chest, others that it struck him multiple times. But all agree on the chaos that followed. A cry erupted. The king staggered, blood spreading across his tunic, staining the feast table red. The goblets of wine, once raised in joy, were knocked aside, their contents mingling with the crimson flow of a king's lifeblood. Panic tore through the hall. Some shouted for vengeance, others fled in terror. Guards rushed forward, swords drawn, but the damage was done. Edmund, 25 years old, the warrior king of Wessex, collapsed onto the rush-strewn floor. His voice, once commanding armies, was drowned in the screams of courtiers and the clash of steel. In that moment, celebration died. The feast of St. Augustine became a scene of horror etched forever into the memory of the realm. The smell of roasted meat gave way to the stench of blood. The laughter of nobles was replaced by the wails of servants. A hall that had been filled with light now seemed consumed by shadow. What made the tragedy so unbearable was its suddenness. Kings fall in battle, they fall to illness, to plots carefully spun over years. But Edmund fell in an instant, at a feast meant to honor a saint, at the hand of a man he had once banished. His greatness, his victories, his youth, none of it shielded him from a single dagger wielded in hatred. For those who witnessed it, the memory would never fade. They would remember the look on the king's face as he realized the danger too late. They would remember the way the music stopped. The torches flickered. The air itself seemed to collapse under the weight of shock. And they would remember that in one heartbeat, England had lost its monarch, and the realm was once again plunged into uncertainty. Thus, the feast at Pucklechurch stands as one of the most haunting symbols of medieval kingship. It was not an army that destroyed Edmund, nor a foreign invader, but a single man with a knife, slipping into a celebration and turning joy into despair. In the very act of confronting danger himself, Edmund revealed the paradox of his reign. His courage made him magnificent, but it also led him to an early grave. The moment the blade struck, time itself seemed to fracture. The hall of Pucklechurch, moments earlier humming with laughter and song, was shattered by a single cry, half gasp, half roar, from the king himself. Edmund the Magnificent staggered backward, his eyes wide with disbelief, his hand instinctively clutching at the wound. Blood welled up between his fingers, bright and unstoppable, spilling onto the wooden floor. The dagger, wielded by the exiled Leofa, had cut deeper than flesh. It had pierced the very heart of a kingdom. Witnesses later described chaos, but chaos is too gentle a word. The feast dissolved into pandemonium. Nobles overturned benches as they scrambled to their feet. Servants dropped their trays, the crash of pewter and clay mingling with the screams of women. The torches lining the hall flickered wildly as if recoiling from the violence they now illuminated. And in the center of it all lay the king, a young man of only 25, blood soaking through the silk that had once proclaimed his majesty. Leofa, in that instant, became both executioner and sacrifice. For though he had struck his blow, the guards descended on him with fury. Steel clanged against steel, shouts filled the air, and the exile was cut down before he could strike again. His body fell beside the king's, his face twisted not in fear, but in grim satisfaction. He had achieved his vengeance, even if it cost him his life. But for Edmund, there was no satisfaction, only the cruel brevity of a reign cut short. He tried to rise, his hand braced against the banquet table, but the strength drained from him faster than he could summon it. Those nearest rushed to his side, friends, retainers, perhaps even priests. But their hands could not staunch the wound. The dagger had been true, and in the 10th century there was no surgeon, no healer who could save a man struck so deep. What must have passed through his mind in those final moments? Did he recall the battles fought in Northumbria, the victories that had secured his fame? Did he think of his sons, still boys, who would never know their father as anything but a figure of legend and loss? Did he wonder if Alfred's dream of a united England had died with him? We cannot know. But the chroniclers are clear. The king's last breaths came swiftly, his life draining away even as the feast still echoed with cries. The symbolism was unbearable. Here was a king, magnificent in youth, brought low not on a battlefield, but in the midst of sacred celebration. The feast of St. Augustine, meant to honor faith and unity, became instead the day of betrayal and blood. The altar of festivity was transformed into an altar of sacrifice, and upon it lay Edmund himself. For those present, the shock cut deeper than grief. They had seen their king as invincible, a warrior who had bested Vikings and tamed rebellion. Yet now they saw him helpless, crumpled on the ground, his lifeblood mingling with spilled wine. It was a revelation as much as a tragedy. Kings were mortal, crowns were fragile, and no amount of courage could shield a man from the sudden strike of hatred. The hall, once filled with music, now resounded with mourning. Monks began to chant prayers for the dying, their voices trembling with urgency. Nobles knelt beside the fallen king, their faces pale with fear, not only for Edmund's soul, but for the fate of the kingdom. Without him, the realm was leaderless, vulnerable once more to enemies within and without. Every man there knew that the crown did not forgive gaps in succession. In a single heartbeat, England's stability had been ripped apart. And yet, in this moment of despair, Edmund's image was sealed forever. He became, in death, the embodiment of bravery and tragedy intertwined. He had confronted danger himself, as a king should. But his recklessness had led him straight into the blade. The people would remember him not only as the magnificent, but as the king who bled out in his youth, slain by a lone exile while defending his honor with his own hands. As the torches dimmed and the hall emptied into the night, the weight of the loss settled over Pucklechurch like a shroud. Outside, the countryside remained quiet, the fields unchanged, the stars indifferent. But within those walls, history had turned. A kingdom had lost its king, and with him, a generation had lost its promised. And the dagger in Edmund's heart was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the age itself. The 10th century was a world where crowns were won and lost in an instant, where kingship was not a shield, but a target, and where magnificence could vanish in a single thrust of steel. The young ruler's blood, spilled on the floor of a feast, told a truth no monk dared ignore. In medieval England, the line between triumph and tragedy was as thin as a blade. The blade that ended a king's life did not remain long in the assassin's hand. No sooner had Leofa struck than the hall erupted in violence. Guards, retainers, even unarmed nobles surged forward, driven by rage and horror. In moments, Leofa was cut down, his body pierced by swords and trampled underfoot. The man who had carried exile like a curse, who had lived for this one act of vengeance, lay lifeless almost as swiftly as the king he slew. There was no trial, no judgment, no mercy. Justice was carried out in raw blood. Some said the guards hacked his body to pieces in fury. Others that they left him sprawled where he fell, ignored in the chaos. But whether his end was brutal or swift, one truth remained. Leofa was gone. Yet his dagger had already altered the course of England. The silence that followed his death was not peace. It was shock. The people in the hall, nobles, priests, servants, looked upon the floor where two bodies lay, the assassin and the king. One forgotten by history until that night, the other destined for remembrance precisely because of it. The torches sputtered in the thick air, and the smell of iron and wine clung to the nostrils of every witness. Many wept openly. Others stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. The chroniclers who later recorded the event were restrained in their words, but imagination can fill the gaps. Men and women clutching each other, their garments stained by spilled drink and royal blood. Priests dropping to their knees, chanting prayers to hasten the king's soul to heaven. Courtiers staring in disbelief, as if expecting Edmund to rise again and dismiss the violence as a nightmare. Yet reality pressed down. The magnificent was dead. Outside the hall, word spread like fire. Messengers galloped into the night, bearing the grim tidings to nearby towns and abbeys. By dawn, the news was already moving across the kingdom. In villages, peasants would hear whispers. The king is slain. Some would gasp, others would shake their heads knowingly. For the common folk, kings came and went, their lives distant from the daily struggle of harvest and survival. Yet even they must have felt the chill. If a king could be struck down in his own hall, then no man was safe from fate's cruelty. For the nobles, the shock was sharper still. They had built their futures around Edmund's reign. His victories in Northumbria had given them pride and stability. His youth promised decades of leadership to come. Now, all of it was gone in an instant, replaced by uncertainty. Who would rule? Would the fragile unity of England collapse once again into rival factions? The crown had slipped, and the realm trembled with it. The church too reeled from the tragedy. To have a king murdered on the feast of St. Augustine was more than political calamity. It was sacrilege. Priests and monks interpreted it as a sign of divine judgment, a reminder that even the most magnificent of rulers was dust before God's will. Chroniclers painted the event in somber tones, as though England itself had sinned and been punished. Yet beneath the piety lay fear. The church relied on kings for protection, and now that shield was gone. Leoffa's death, swift as it was, did not erase his deed. If anything, it magnified it. He had become the man who proved that the crown could bleed. His name would never be remembered for anything else, but that was enough. He had carved himself into the story of England, not by building, but by destroying. And in doing so, he reminded every noble, every courtier, every servant, that the grandeur of monarchy was only ever one step away from annihilation. For Edmund's closest companions, grief was personal. They had fought beside him in battle, shared bread and wine, followed his banner into the north. Now they saw him pale, lifeless, his promise extinguished. Some must have raged at their own failure to protect him. Others must have cursed his recklessness for confronting Leoffa himself. But all were united in sorrow. They had lost not just a king, but a comrade. The following days were heavy with ritual. Edmund's body, prepared with care, was carried from Pucklechurch to Glastonbury Abbey, where he would be laid to rest. Along the way, mourners lined the roads, their silence heavier than wails. Bells tolled from monasteries, their sound a dirge that echoed across the countryside. The youth who had once been hailed as the savior of England was now a corpse borne on a bier, his future stolen, his reign reduced to memory. The kingdom itself seemed suspended between grief and fear. The assassin was dead, yet the wound he inflicted bled on. Nobles whispered of succession. Priests prayed for divine mercy. Commoners muttered about omens. In the quiet corners of taverns and fields, the story was retold again and again. how the young king, bold and rash, had confronted a lone exile, and how that moment of bravery had ended in tragedy. Thus, the death of Leofa did not close the tale. It opened another, the story of a kingdom without its king, of sons too young to rule, of a throne passed into uncertain hands. The assassin's body might have been trampled into the earth, but his act reverberated like a storm across England. The magnificent was gone, and the realm shivered in the shadow of his absence. When Edmund's blood cooled on the floor of Pucklechurch, the crown of England grew heavier than ever. In the sudden vacuum left by his death, the kingdom faced not only grief, but also the most dangerous of medieval crises: succession. Edmund left behind two sons, Edwig and Edgar, both mere children. Too young to hold a sword, too young to issue decrees, too young even to sit upon the throne without help. Their innocence, once a comfort to their father, became a peril to the realm. For in the 10th century, a child king was little more than an invitation for usurpers to rise, for nobles to scheme, for enemies abroad to strike. The council of nobles and clergy moved swiftly. They could not risk delay. Every day without a king was a day of weakness. Their eyes turned to Edmund's younger brother, Edred. He was not the heir by bloodline's strictest order, but he was the only viable option. Grown, capable, and loyal to the dynasty of Wessex, he could hold the throne until Edmund's sons were of age, or perhaps longer, if fate demanded. Thus, within weeks of the tragedy, Edred was proclaimed king. The coronation was somber, stripped of triumph. Where Edmund had once been crowned in the vigor of youth, Edred took the anointing oil in the shadow of his brother's blood. He did not inherit a crown of glory, but a crown already stained by murder. The people hailed him, but their voices were subdued, weighed down by fear. Could this new king hold together the fragile unity Edmund had fought so hard to restore? The transition was precarious. Though Leofa was dead, his dagger still lingered in memory, a reminder that the crown could be pierced. Nobles whispered of the young princes, debating whether they should one day reclaim their father's throne. Some feared division, factions forming around Edred on one side, the sons of Edmund on the other. In such divisions, dynasties had crumbled before, and the specter of civil war loomed in every council chamber. For the people, the sense of fragility deepened. They had celebrated Edmund's victories, only to see him struck down at 25. Now they looked to Edred, not with the confidence that had greeted his brother, but with wary hope. The north still simmered with unrest. Viking ambitions had not been extinguished, and the kingdom's borders trembled at the possibility of fresh invasion. Was Edred strong enough? Would the unity survive another blow? In Glastonbury Abbey, where Edmund's body rested, pilgrims began to whisper prayers not only for his soul, but for the survival of England itself. His tomb, simple yet solemn, became a place of mourning. The monks recorded his reign with brevity, but with reverence. A king cut down too soon, a life measured not in decades, but in a handful of victories and one unforgettable tragedy. His sons, growing in the shadows, would later visit and feel the weight of inheritance not yet theirs. The court, meanwhile, worked to project stability. Charters were issued in Edred's name. Gifts were made to churches, as though piety could mend the wound left by violence. The machinery of kingship creaked forward, but the absence of Edmund was palpable. He had been young, bold, decisive. Edred was thoughtful, cautious, burdened by illness. The shift in style was stark, and the kingdom adjusted uneasily. Yet the true emptiness of the throne was not only political, it was emotional. For those who had known Edmund personally, his death was not simply the loss of a ruler, but of a companion. His warriors remembered his laughter around the fire, his reckless courage in battle, his presence in the feast hall. To them, the throne seemed vacant even as Edred sat upon it, for no man could fill the void of Edmund's youth and fire. The image of the empty throne haunted England. It symbolized the fragility of monarchy in an age where power could be snatched away in an instant. For peasants, it was a reminder that their fates were tied to men who might vanish without warning. For nobles, it was a warning that their ambitions were never safe. For the church, it was a lesson that even an anointed king could bleed. And for history, it became the pivot upon which Edmund's memory turned. His reign, though short, was remembered less for its victories than for its end. The empty throne was his legacy, a symbol of what might have been, of potential left unrealized, of a future stolen before it could unfold. In the years to come, Edred would rule, and Edmund's sons would eventually ascend. Edgar, the younger, would one day be called the peaceful, presiding over a more stable age. Yet even his successes were built upon the foundation of loss, the void left by a father murdered at a feast. Every triumph of Edgar's reign was shadowed by the memory of Edmund's blood on the floor of Pucklechurch. The empty throne, then, was not truly empty. It was filled with absence, with the ghost of a king who had shone brightly and briefly, only to be extinguished by a single dagger. And in that ghost lay the lesson of Edmund's fate. That power in medieval England was never secure, that even magnificence could be undone in a moment, and that behind every crown lay silence waiting to fall. Edmund the Magnificent remains one of history's briefest flames. A king who rose young, ruled fiercely, and died before the fullness of his promise could unfold. His story is not only about violence or betrayal, but about the fragility of human ambition. He reminds us that power is fleeting, that courage can become recklessness, and that even a crown cannot shield a man from fate. Yet within his tragedy lies a quiet legacy, the vision of unity he carried forward, the memory of youth cut short, and the timeless truth that greatness and vulnerability walk side by side.